May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
There is what's probably an apocryphal story that tells about a commencement address given by the author Kurt Vonnegut, in which he advised the members of the graduating class to live in New York City once, but leave before you get too hard. And to live in Northern California once, but leave before you get too soft. I lived in New York City while I was in seminary for 3 years, and I think it was about the right amount of time. I developed enough of a shell to feel safe in the city, but not enough to be impervious to the world. I grew up in Iowa. The summers were a humid 95 most of the time in July and August, and then when we moved out here, came to interview at least in late December of 1984, it was 22 degrees below zero when we left the Moline Airport. I've been here 35 years now. And if it gets down to about 65, I'm getting a little chilly. And anything over 74 is hot. 70, 71, that's really good. I've gotten soft. I thought of that when I read the Old Testament lesson for today. The Hebrew people had been slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh had forgotten the relationship with Joseph. They were toiling under his whips, making bricks without straw, no hope in sight. And then Moses came from God as their deliverer. And when Pharaoh refused to listen, and Egypt suffered plague after plague, Moses came back again and again, saying, "Let my people go." And then when Pharaoh did let them go, but changed his mind, pursuing them and Moses at the Red Sea through God's power, Moses parted the waters. The people were saved. Their enemies were drowned. But what have you done for us lately, Moses? The complaining began once they got to the wilderness, and pretty quickly after they got to the wilderness. They asked Moses if he brought them out of Egypt to kill them with hunger. But after what they'd experienced, you'd think they'd have, a little more faith. God gave them quail then for dinner that night and the holy manna every morning to sustain them on the journey. Miracle after miracle after miracle. Freed from slavery, crossing the sea, fed in the wilderness. But that, I guess, still wasn't enough. In the book of Numbers, it says the people of Israel wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." Never enough. And then again, further on in the wilderness, the people became thirsty. And it says they murmured against Moses, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us with thirst? And our children and our cattle?" So Moses struck the rock, and water came flowing out. And you'd think they'd learned their lesson. Not quite yet. When Moses stayed too long on the holy mountain of God, they became impatient, and they made a golden calf to worship. Now, that's sort of an extreme example of what maybe is a very universal human tendency, which is to complain. We can always imagine something better than we have. And that imagined reality always judges the actual reality, finds it lacking in some way. That even starts at the beginning of the Bible. I mean, Adam and Eve were living in paradise. Not the one that burned down 2 years ago. Real paradise. But a little discontent began to grow in Eve. She heard a voice, and maybe it was the serpent. Maybe it was the voice of that human tendency to imagine something better. If you eat the fruit of the tree that's forbidden, you'll be wise. You'll be like God. We can be acutely aware of the problems that we face now, but we rarely see the downside of some imagined improvements to life. We never think about the unintended consequences, and there are always unintended consequences. Adam didn't think about having to plow the field. Eve didn't think about labor and childbirth. We don't think of what problems may arise in the future that are caused by fixing the problems we have now. We say, what have we got to lose? The gospel reading deals, I think, with the same problem from a different angle. The parable of the workers in the vineyard, those who worked for only an hour, getting paid the same as those who worked all day. It probably originally was meant to address the issue of the inclusion of Gentiles by the Christians in the covenant during these last days, a covenant that the Jews had been following for 1,000 years. God's grace was being offered freely to all, no matter how recently they'd come to the faith. And that didn't seem fair to those previously chosen. They thought they were special. They thought they should get more. There's no such thing, though, as more or less grace. And the parable in the gospel today, I think, makes that point pretty well. At the risk of being seen as a one-trick pony, I need to point out, as I did last week and as I do or have done any number of times, the key is acceptance. Acceptance of the reality that God has brought into our lives rather than trying to exchange it for some imagined better state of things. Earlier in Matthew, Jesus said, consider the lilies of the field, consider the birds of the air. They're not anxious. They're not resentful. They're not always comparing what actually is with how they want it to be. Let the day's own trouble be sufficient for the day, Jesus says. Asking God to damn a hammer that's just hit my thumb isn't going to make the thumb hurt less. Both of these stories point in different ways to the human desire to control things, to control the environment we live in, to control what happens in that environment, to control the people that we meet, to control our reality. And these stories also show us the impossibility of ever really doing that. And that's really a harder lesson, I think, for us today in our world than it was for the Hebrews in the wilderness, or the people listening to Jesus talk to them. With all the innovation and progress, especially in modern times, it does seem like we have a whole lot of control. The environment we live in, the people we interact with, even the future we create. Or at least we think that somebody, some startup in Silicon Valley is going to take care of that future any day now. There may be ups and downs, we think, detours to take, tactical retreats. But we're a smart species. And we've become confident in our progress. We found cures for most disease. We've nearly eliminated famine from the world. We've gone to the moon, sent probes beyond the solar system. We've connected the planet through the World Wide Web. When I was in India in 1970, it took 6 weeks for me to mail a letter to my parents in Iowa and to get a reply. And now we can Skype or FaceTime or Zoom instantly with anyone almost anywhere. But then again, there always seem to be those unintended consequences. Climate change brought on mostly by our success is pushing the earth to uninhabitability. Oops. We need to be a lot more humble. We need to realize we can't control most of life. We need to stop trying to conquer the wilderness and begin to really relate with it. Begin to find our true place in it as a part of nature. We need to realize that nature isn't made up of objects for us to manipulate and use. It's filled with fellow beings, animate and inanimate, fellow beings that we're called to care for and love. Now, it may sound like I'm just not accepting the fact that people aren't accepting, which could go round and round and round. But I think it's possible, and I think we need to be open to a deep transformation. A transformation that takes us past the fear that leads both to our wishful thinking and our defensive cynicism. Because as Christians, we already look at life a little differently than most people in the world. We have different values. We look through a wider lens. So we can help guide the world as it goes through this wilderness. And we can teach the world, as Jesus teaches us in this parable of inclusion in the kingdom of heaven, that no matter how long we've been enslaved in our own private Egypt, no matter how hungry or thirsty or impatient we feel in the wilderness, we are all heading for the promised land and maybe a return to paradise. Thanks be to God.